Moving inside the Vanquish, it's a beautiful place to be. This car isn't exactly what you would call light. You breathe on the pedal, oh, it's so good. Hi everyone, I'm Kennan from Cars and Bids, and today we're talking about something extremely beautiful. This is the 2014 Aston Martin Vanquish Volante, known as the Vanquish 2 in the Aston Martin community. And in today's video, we're going to be discussing its facts and figures. First, we'll take a look at where the Vanquish fits into Aston Martin's past. Then, of course, we'll get nerdy and we'll talk about the technical details of this car. And then we'll do what everyone wants to do with an Aston Martin and take this thing for a drive. Before we get going though, surprise, surprise, this Aston Martin Vanquish is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. As I mentioned, this is the Volante version of this car, which means it's the fully convertible version of the Vanquish. It's also finished in Ferrari Rossa Corsa with this beautiful tan interior, and it comes with some desirable optional extras, including the Bang Olufsen sound system, contrasting red stitching, and things like that. And after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below where you can head to the live auction of this one, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. We begin the story of the 2014 Vanquish by first discussing, well, the first Vanquish. Introduced in 2001 at the Geneva Motor Show and designed by Ian Callum, this car was designed to be the flagship of Aston Martin, as it signaled their new approach for their cars for the new millennium. Its design brief was that it would house a naturally aspirated V12 engine, 2+2 architecture, and it would be a technical showcase for Aston Martin, most notably with their sequential manual gearbox, because at the time, that was the newest, hottest technology. Of course, over time, that transmission would become one of the sticking points with that car, but Aston Martin nonetheless debuted it as that was the thing to do. Produced from 2001 until 2007, the Vanquish nameplate would eventually disappear in favor of the performance-focused version of the DB9, the DBS. Then in 2012 at Villa d'Este, a very appropriate location, Aston Martin announced the AM310 concept. Later in 2012, at other events, it would become clear that this was going to be the new Vanquish, and it was gorgeous. Just like the original Vanquish, it had a very similar philosophy. There was a naturally aspirated V12 up front, 2 doors, of course, and 4 seating, in spirit only, as well. The rear seats are very tight on both generations of the Vanquish. This car was also notable as it would use the VH, or vertical horizontal design philosophy, that was originally developed for the DB9. Now, I recently did a video on a DB9, so I've covered that already, but all you need to know is that this was a design philosophy that Aston Martin used to develop their cars across several platforms. The idea being that they could develop one platform and iterate on it for several cars. That's also why a lot of Aston Martins look very similar. However, this was misunderstood by some. People were under the impression that this was using the same chassis as the DB9, but that wasn't so. It was using the same design philosophy that was used with the DB9, but it was VH3, a whole new platform for the Vanquish, but it was going to be the last time that Aston Martin would use this philosophy going forward. Technically, the Rapide was the last Aston Martin to use the VH architecture, but this was the last GT Aston, or in some people's eyes, the last true Aston to use that particular design philosophy. The Vanquish would then be produced from 2012 until 2018, when it was eventually replaced, ironically, by the DBS Superleggera. And so in the Aston Martin lineage, there was a Vanquish, then a DBS, then a Vanquish again, and then another DBS. And now we move on to the overall design of the Vanquish, because it is exceptionally good looking. But of course, that's not by accident. Aston Martin uses the rule of thirds when they design cars, and this is applicable to every aspect of this car. For instance, the design of the window aperture relative to the rest of the door is 1/3 of the entire space. Similarly, the front grille is designed this way too. It's 1/3 of the entire front of the car. This design philosophy extends to things even like the vents located on the fender. There's a line that goes through them, and that is 1/3 of the entire height of the vent. The result is that a lot of Aston Martins look relatively similar to one another, as they use the same design philosophy, but they are all extremely beautiful, and that largely comes down to the rule of thirds. Aston Martin would also use the 177 Supercar, their limited production car from years before this thing, to design this car. They would use a lot of really cool design elements that made their way into this thing. Most notably, the vent design and the extension from it into the door. This beautiful look comes originally from the 177. The headlight design is also very similar to what you found on that car, as is the relatively bizarre steering wheel that is in this car. It's kind of square and unique, and it stems from the 177. The attention to detail with this car, though, when it comes to design, of course, is not just skin deep. Aston Martin had a very specific focus for the Vanquish. They wanted to get as close to 50-50 weight distribution as possible, but that was going to be difficult. This car was going to have a very heavy, very large V12 engine at the front, and so Aston Martin had to get a little bit creative. They solved this problem by putting the transmission at the back of this car, and they got very close. They have 51%, 49% weight distribution, so not 50-50 exactly, but still very close. In addition to playing with the drivetrain locations with this car, Aston Martin would also focus on making certain components as light as they could, most notably with the hood, which is made of carbon fiber, and you see that the second you open it, and you see that beautiful weave throughout. The trunk was also made out of carbon fiber, and similarly, when you open it, you see that beautiful weave. This was a particularly difficult part for Aston Martin to make, as it's a very complicated shape. However, this car isn't exactly what you would call light. It weighs over 3,800 pounds. It is definitely a hefty GT car. However, again, Aston Martin wasn't necessarily focused on outright lightness. They just wanted to get as close to a balanced sports car as they could, and they did that with the Vanquish. In addition to making sure this car was balanced, Aston Martin also wanted to make sure that it was strong. This car was much more torsionally rigid compared to its predecessor, the DBS. In the case of the Volante, the convertible version specifically, it was 13% stiffer than the DBS Volante that came before it. And so, although this car is very heavy, Aston Martin made sure that it was a more modern driving experience compared to its predecessor. It's time to talk about the Aston Martin Vanquish's suspension. Now, this being a GT car and a large one at that, Aston Martin had room to fit double wishbone suspension all around, and this is hugely beneficial because it meant that this car could be set up to handle very well, but it also meant that it could have a soft ride, which is very critical with a GT car. This car also has electronically adjustable dampers with 3 settings: normal, sport, and track. Kind of insane for a GT car, but nonetheless, of course, it has it. The more interesting part about the suspension would be the geometry that Aston Martin decided to use. At the front of this car, Aston Martin would design it to be anti-dive, meaning that as you would brake, the nose wouldn't dive toward the ground, which is better for balance with this car. At the rear, Aston Martin would use anti-squat technology, and the idea with this is that as you accelerate, the weight shifts to the rear of the car, and Aston Martin designed it to shift enough to give you traction, but not too much that it would upset the balance of the car. Very clever solutions to make this car, again, very balanced to drive. While we're up here, we have to talk about this car's brakes, which are hidden behind these aftermarket BBS wheels. Up front, we have 6 piston calipers with 15.7-inch rotors. At the rear, we have 4 piston calipers with 14.2-inch rotors. As you might expect with a car of this era, it has carbon ceramic brakes, which are best for heat dissipation, although admittedly, they are a little bit of overkill on a road car. However, this car is very heavy and very expensive, so it made sense that you would see the ultimate braking technology on the Vanquish. Now we move under the carbon fiber hood to talk about the star of the show, and that, of course, is this gigantic 6-liter V12. It's actually a 5.9-liter V12, dubbed the AM28, but it is magnificent. It produces 565 horsepower and 457 foot-pounds of torque, which means that the coupe version of this car can get from 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds. The convertible version is slightly slower, getting from 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds, but regardless, this is a massively powerful engine, and this car is still very fast. As I talked about in my DB9 video, there are some misconceptions that surround this engine though. Most notably, that people think it is 2 Ford Duratec V6s put together and that gives us the V12. That's actually not the case. Although Aston Martin used Ford engineers to help develop this engine, there are a lot of differences between this and the Duratec V6. Some of the main differences include the materials that this engine used were much higher grade. It used a much higher grade aluminum for the engine block, and there are a lot of other differences too. The head design is completely different with these cars, the bank-to-bank offset is different, and many other details. All you need to know is that while a lot of people say, oh, it's 2 Ford Duratec V6s put together, no. This is a very different engine, and it is very special by itself. While I'm under here, there are a couple of other things I want to talk about, most notably, again, with the hood. In addition to being made completely of carbon fiber, it also has actual vents on it that actually do something. This engine gets quite warm, and so it has functional air vents to get the heat out of this engine located near the intakes to keep the air going into this engine as cool as possible, reducing heat soak. This car also uses a gigantic chassis brace located here, and one of my favorite details is that it's so large it actually cuts into the windshield cowling. There's a little crescent that's cut out for this, and the chassis bracing actually continues into the cowling. This is kind of unusual, but Aston Martin was really pressed for space under here, and so you have this unusual windshield cowling courtesy of this giant chassis brace. Moving inside the Vanquish, well, it's a beautiful place to be. Everything is covered in beautiful wear leather, and it looks truly outstanding. Reportedly, it takes 70 hours to construct the interior of a Vanquish, and well, it's easy to see why. There's lots of stitching everywhere, and it's just a beautiful place to be. The main thing I want to talk about in the interior of this car would be its transmission. This uses the ZF 8-speed Touchtronic 2 transmission. That's right, not a dual clutch. This car uses a normal torque converter. In 2015, Aston Martin would switch to the Touchtronic 3, a later update of the ZF 8-speed automatic. Regardless, you find the Touchtronic 2 system in this particular car. Another notable addition to the interior of this car would be this little button located on the center console. It says LC, and it has a checkered flag on it, and it's exactly what you would guess. Launch control. Now this is relevant because although it was in a lot of other sports cars at the time, it wasn't in any other Aston Martin. This was the first Aston available with launch control. And although I'm not going to use it today, or honestly would ever use it, launch control is something that you found first in the Vanquish by pressing that little button. Okay, time to drive the Aston Martin Vanquish. Now, I'm a huge fan of these cars. I was actually a huge fan of the previous generation Vanquish as well. A friend of mine, his dad had one of those when we were a little younger, growing up, and I've always thought that was one of the most beautiful cars. And so when this car came out, it followed in that Vanquish tradition. This is also a breathtakingly pretty car. That and... oh my God! Oh, the sound. Wow. Oh, nothing beats a V12, but this V12 in particular, the AM28 V12, is outstanding. Come on. That is how an Aston Martin is supposed to sound. That's magnificent. So unlike the previous generation Vanquish, which had that sequential manual gearbox that was challenging at best, I think is the nicest way you could put it, this car has a ZF automatic, and it transforms the driving experience. It's definitely so smooth and so wonderful, and that was one of the benefits of the DB9 when it came out, because it too got the option of, you could get it with a manual, but it also got an automatic transmission, which really suits these cars. These are grand touring cars. As I mentioned, yeah, there's a lot of lightweight construction in this car, and it has 177 Supercar inspired design to it, but this is a GT car first and foremost. And at the heart of the experience, I'm gonna say it again, is that engine, because you breathe on the pedal. Oh, it's so good. Makes a lot of torque too. This engine is very powerful, and although you might not think that this car is all that quick, when you look at the numbers, the coupe doing 0 to 60 in 3.6, that's pretty fast, and this car 4.3, it's certainly no slouch. But that said, it's about the experience and the way the engine delivers power. It's just so smooth and effortless, and you just thunder off down the road in your V12. That's what it's all about with this car. And man, this engine just suits the dynamics of the car so beautifully. Other aspects of the car that I love, in addition to the looks and the sound, this interior is amazing. Everything is just covered in leather, and it's beautiful. Aston Martin uses the Weir leather. It's a specific type of leather they use, a company they partner with for their interiors, like Ferrari does with Connolly. It's wonderful. The grain of this leather is so fine, and it just looks lovely. It's just a lovely place to be. This beautiful blend of leather and Alcantara and the aluminum grills, especially on the Bang Olufsen sound system. It's really wonderful. Wow, that's not a low number. The suspension system is great too. This feels like a real GT car. It's very comfortable. You could just kind of cruise around. I'm in comfort mode. I think that's how you should experience this car. It has a sport mode too, but in all honesty, like, you know, why do you need it? Why do you really need that in a car like this? This is just meant for cruising, top down like this. This is what this car is built for. This car in a lot of ways too is kind of a celebration of Aston Martin, and it was the end of the VH platform, as I mentioned, but also it was the end of Aston's own NA V12s. After this, with the next generation DBS, you've got a turbocharged Mercedes V12, which on its own is a wonderful engine, one of my favorites. But at the same time, this engine has so much character and history with Aston Martin. It's not a Ford Duratec V6 derived engine. There are some similarities, and there actually are a couple of components carried over, but it's a very special and different engine. The engine is just so fabulous. It's what you hope from an Aston Martin V12. Smooth, sonorous, and just, I just adore it. Just lovely. And so I think this car really, if you're looking to buy one of these, you're the kind of person who wants the sports car experience. You want to enjoy comfort. You appreciate good build quality in terms of like the materials and the handmade finish that this car offers. You love style, and you just want to enjoy a nice car. And this thing delivers. Ah, wonderful, 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 wonderful. And that is the Aston Martin Vanquish Volante. This is everything you would expect an Aston Martin to be. It's gorgeous to look at, has a sonorous V12 engine, and it's a wonderfully pleasant car to drive. These are also relatively reliable by Aston Martin standards, and they are an exceptional value today. And if you've been in the market for one of these, you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye.